In this lecture, we will be examining the phenomenon of slavery in the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. There were a number of features of Roman slavery that differed from other forms of slavery in world history, while in some ways, as we will see, Roman slavery served as a model for later forms of involuntary servitude. As Rome conquered the Mediterranean world, millions of slaves were captured in the process. Many of these worked on large plantations known as Latifundia. We'll get to that in several slides. Some worked in mines, some worked in houses and workplaces of wealthy citizens. The Roman economy eventually became heavily dependent on slave labor, and at one point slaves made up to 40% of the population of the Roman Empire. Unlike some historical examples of slavery, some slaves in the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire had more prestigious jobs. They might work as singers, as scribes, as jewelers, even doctors. One source noted that a slave trained in medicine had a worth of up to 50 agricultural slaves by comparison. Working conditions for slaves in Roman cities were somewhat better in general than for slaves in rural regions of the empire. Slave laborers would be often chained together while performing work in agricultural settings. In agriculture and mining, the treatment of slaves was particularly severe. Throughout Roman history, slaves encountered recurrent violence. Sex ratios were typically unbalanced, with more male slaves than female slaves in agricultural settings. Slaves were typically not allowed to have families during the Roman Republic and the early centuries of the empire, but as we will see, that began to change later. The Spartacus uprising in 73 BCE was the largest slave revolt, but not the only one. These were known collectively as the Servile Wars. The image on this slide is of a Roman slave medallion from the 1st century BCE. Some masters used devices like this to help identify slaves if they ran away, while others used tattoos or forms of branding to help identify runaway slaves. The Latin term latifundia refers to agricultural property that extends over an enormous area. The latifundia, that's the plural form of the word, in Roman history were massive landed estates that focused on agricultural products intended for export, such as wine, grain, and olive oil. These estates typically depended on large numbers of slaves to meet the labor demands and to maintain the expected profitability of the agricultural enterprise. The image on this slide is of a 1st century BCE mosaic that depicts life on a Roman latifundium, the singular form of the word. In the lower right-hand corner, if you look closely, you can see an overseer whipping an agricultural slave. As mentioned earlier, the Spartacus Revolt was better known to historians as the Third Servile War, one of numerous revolts throughout Roman history, but this one was particularly noteworthy. The revolt lasted from 73 BCE to about 71 BCE. It was led by a slave named Spartacus, depicted here in this image, being played by Kirk Douglas in the film version of Spartacus. We believe Spartacus was originally from the region of Thracia, near the Black Sea. The revolt involved perhaps as many as 75,000 slaves, criminals, and peasants. We're not quite sure what the goals of the revolt were, and they remain the subject of debate among historians today. Some suggest that the slaves intended to return to Gaul, which is modern-day France, where many of them were from. They wanted to cross the Alps and go back home. Others believed that they had plans to march on Rome, because when they seemed to be escaping, they suddenly turned south and faced their enemies again. The slave army achieved numerous victories over Roman militias in the first few battles, but eventually these renegade slaves were slaughtered by a massive legion of 50,000 soldiers led by Marcus Crassus. The term Servus publicus, or public slave, was a slave owned by the Roman people. Public slaves worked in temples, in the government offices, and other public functions in Rome and the outlying municipalities of the empire. Many of these slaves performed tasks as servants to public officials. Some talented public slaves performed work such as accounting and other what we would today consider to be managerial functions of an organization. Many slaves in the category of servus publicus were allowed to earn money for their individual use. In this particular image, or set of images here, the inscription in the image indicates that this funerary monument was established by a servus publicus whose name was Papias, for his beloved partner Grania Faustina, and for himself and their children. It's likely that Grania Faustina was a free woman based on the text here, since it was not uncommon for public slaves to have relationships with freed women or even free-born Roman women. Interestingly, in this inscription, Papias used the term slave partner, since slaves did not have the right to enter into a legally documented Roman marriage. The main source of slaves in both the Roman Republic and eventually the Roman Empire were people captured either in war or bought from victors in other wars and other raids. This map shows the geographical location and time frame from which slaves were captured by the Romans. The purple region shows imperial expansion up to 264 BCE, mainly in the Italian peninsula. The pink region, or pink regions, show imperial expansion between 264 and 146 BCE, when slavery rose to become a highly important component of the Roman economy. You can see the pink areas in the eastern shores of the Adriatic and much of what we would today call Spain and Portugal, plus Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and parts of modern-day Tunisia. Further imperial expansion between 146 BCE and 44 BCE is in that sort of yellowish color. This was the height of the era of slave capture and importation in Imperial Rome, and these, I can't understress the importance of imperial expansion and the growth of slavery, as literally as troops would come back from a conflict, they would bring with them slaves by the droves, and very thriving slave markets throughout the Roman Empire. During the Roman Republic, slaves were relatively inexpensive. The frequent conquests of expansion resulted in many thousands and into millions of captives. Due to these low prices, it was not especially profitable for there to be a domestic slave trade or the breeding of slaves for the purpose of slavery. However, the supply of captives declined in the 1st century CE, and then the price of slaves then exceeded the cost of raising them. This decline, of course, was associated with the end of the significant expansion of the Roman Empire. Again, these two go hand in hand. As a result of this lack of expansion and the high prices of slaves, a new class of slaves emerged that was known as Servi casati. We'll cover that on the next slide here. The term Servi casati, as the slide indicates, refers to hutted slaves, literally translated. Estates became reorganized, and these hutted slaves now did the work. These were slaves sort of permanently ensconced on the Latifundia. Slaves in this time, so this is beginning, you start to see this in the 1st century BCE, but by the 1st century CE, this really starts to change, and Servi casati becomes sort of the norm. Slaves are permitted to have houses, to have families. They were allowed to grow their own food on their own plots in exchange for working on the Latifundia. And Roman slavery really began to look much like medieval serfdom which we will cover in a few weeks in another lecture. This brings to a close our discussion of Roman slavery.